Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FTX podcast. I'm very happy to have here with me for the third time Andre Cronje, the founder of Urine and several other projects. Welcome, Andre.
Thanks, Tristan. I think I'm the first one to do 3 of these, eh?
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay.
Three-part Tita.
I need to keep that ratio going. So whenever someone starts catching up, just ping me on Telegram so that we can set up another one, because I need to keep my lead.
That sounds good to me, man. And I know you've done this on the previous 2, but would you mind giving a little introduction of yourself for those that may have not listened to the other ones?
I think it deteriorates every time you ask me that question, because at this point I'm a Solidity dev. I code stuff in ETH, I deploy it, I see if it works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and I just keep doing that. So
that's a good introduction. We'll take it.
Maybe code mad scientist. I'm gonna go with that.
Do you have the crazy hair to match as well?
Not yet, but give me a month and I'll grow it out.
Okay, perfect. I know it's been about 3.5 months or so since we've spoken. Last time we spoke, Keeper was starting. There was stable credit. There was a few different things where your energy was focused. What has been happening? Where is all your energy now? What's the latest developments in your ecosystem, Andre?
I mean, so I'm always sort of more on that RD&D side. I need to just be experimenting. So Keeper's doing its job. It's managing the backend infrastructure of a lot of the current projects in and out of sort of the Urine ecosystem. So it's there's products that originate thanks to Keeper, stuff like Meta Wallet, or limit orders for SushiSwap, or rebalancing portfolios and token sets, stuff like that. So that's sort of the newer things I'm working on. But so the way it goes, it's always sort of iterate, see if something works. If something works, try and build a community around it of developers and ecosystem partners or social media managers, whatever it is, so that they can sort of turn it into a real project. And then I try and explore the next area. So a lot of my focus is still sort of in that stable credit area. It's evolved a lot since its first iterations. So at the point where it is now, we've sort of figured out the pool, impermanent loss slash single-sided exposure side, and that's going all right. But there's still a few problems there because of how Uniswap handles with if a trade happens, the LP side is actually more affected than the trade itself. So there's still some things we have to figure out there. We're looking at combining that into some lending platforms so that it ends up being sort of a credit line tokenization of debt that you can offer there. The stuff with Iron Bank that we're doing, which is basically allowing smart contracts to have, under collateralized loans, as long as we have it audited and checked out and make sure that it's a closed loop ecosystem. Experimenting a lot with inter-lending asset aggregation, which I don't want to go into too much detail now, because that should be coming out soon. Yeah, man, as always, just trying to explore, trying to think up new things to do in this ecosystem, and trying to see how we can, leverage each other more and the opportunities more.
Moving. Well, out of all those things, I have a few of those I'd like to touch a bit more on that I've found interesting looking into them. The first would be Keeper, which I have to say I sort of understand, but I don't really understand. How would you explain Keeper to someone that wasn't the most DeFi native, if you had a way of doing that?
So the thing about Keeper, and I've tried explaining this on the forum and on Twitter a few times, because I get a lot of people message me and hey, I need to write more about Keeper, or I need to explain Keeper better. But Keeper isn't for the end user consumer. It's built for other projects in mind. So at the lowest level, right, is why do I build stuff? So I build stuff when I face a problem and I want to solve that problem. So the original problem statement we had at Yearn was, we've got the strategies, but now the thing about everything on Ethereum, right? Ethereum doesn't work unless you trigger something. So a smart contract can't sit there and check its own balance, and if its balance is over a certain amount, then it does something with that. So like the only way for the state on Ethereum to change is for an external interaction into the system. So nothing happens unless there is a transaction that originates it. If all transactions were to stop now that go into Ethereum, Ethereum would be in a motionless state. But now what this means is, that every time we needed to do a harvest or we needed to do a earn call to move funds from the vault to the strategy, any of these stuff, we had little bots that we wrote, in Python and JavaScript and these things, and they're sitting on servers, either that we self-host or DigitalOcean or AWS or whatever it is, and they periodically ping these contracts. They see, is it in a state that I need to do something? And if it is in a state that I need to do something, they sign a transaction. So, they're externally owned accounts with the private key that's owned by a little bot, and that bot signs the transaction and it executes the transaction. As you can imagine, that quickly gets really expensive, because now you've got this infrastructure. We have to continuously be just like spending ETH to maintain this stuff, and these bots aren't really getting value out of it. So now there were three primary problems I really wanted to solve. Is how do I create sort of an autonomous, decentralized way to do this, so that it's not my bot sitting on my machine using my ETH. Number two is how do I create a sort of incentivization layer around this that matches people willing to do this work with the contracts that need to do the work in like an autonomous and a sustainable fashion. Third one is as we spoke to other projects, we realized they're all doing this, like Makers running bots that do it, Synthetics is doing the same, Hedge is doing the same. We all have our own bots that are doing this stuff, but like that's not fault redundant. If our infrastructure goes down, then the system doesn't work. So you need to find a way how you also add those redundancies for the actual scripts that are running, and at the same time you also want to find a way so that each project doesn't have to do this, because it like DevOps is a expertise in its own. Like you have to have, your servers have to have backups and they need to be fault redundant, and what happens if the connectivity goes down on that machine, or the hard drive gets full because of log writes, or there's so much stuff like that happens, and that's not necessarily everyone's expertise. So if you think about like pre Hetzner or DigitalOcean or AWS days, you had to run your own server and you had to have your own reverse IP lookup of your ISP, and your website was on there, and you had a public facing IP that when people visited your website, they were actually visiting that IP that's publicly accessible via your ISP, and that's accessing your server locally. So this means if you wanted to run a website, you also needed to run a server and DevOps, and you needed to maintain the ISP line and uptime and all of these things. And that was huge overhead. And then things like Hetzner started coming along, where you could just boot up a machine, and then at least you didn't have to worry about the machine. Like they would make sure that it's taken care of in terms of disk and like the hardware components, but you still had to take care of all of the software components. And later on AWS came along with like sort of their easy to virtualization instances and stuff, and like now it's at the point where you don't worry about any of that stuff. Like if you look at something like Elastic Beanstalk on AWS, that's, you give it code, you tell it run my code, and it does everything else. So you don't worry about the DevOps, the server, the hardware, the underlying patches that you need to upgrade and stuff like that. So like that's the best way I would describe Keeper is, like it started with everyone had to do it themselves on their own systems, and Keeper is this iteration of you don't have to. Like if you have something that needs to happen in a reliable, autonomous, and decentralized way, then you just submit your job into Keeper, and then the Keepers, they like 9 out of 10 times you don't even have to give documentation. The like Keeper maintainers quickly go through the code, see what they need to do, especially if you keep to the spec. Because we've seen new jobs being added without any documentation that get executed within like 5 minutes, because these Keeper guys just figure out how this stuff works. And then all of a sudden you've got a fault tolerant, redundant, sustainable system that can handle all of this maintenance for you. So I think, like, as a user, you don't really see all this maintenance that's happening in the background, because there's constantly little things happening. Like in Hedgic, a position has to be closed if it expires. In Yearn, a harvest has to be called. In Synthetic, the debt pool has to be updated. So there's always these things that all of these projects are doing. And I mean, especially if you think about something like liquidations, you know, that's happening all external to the system. So if people stop running liquidations, you know, the entire system's under collateralized and it all falls down. So like all of these little micro executions are incredibly important. And at the same time, for a project, you don't necessarily have the expertise to run your own infrastructure, your own DevOps, your own tooling. So like this allows you as a project you focus on your code, you focus on your niche, and any stuff that has to happen periodically or systematically in your code, you just give to Keeper and the keepers manage it for you, and they make sure that your uptime is there. And you know, there's lots of fault redundancy there because there's 50 or whatever keepers all trying to bid for the same job, trying to complete it as quickly as they can. So that's why, you know, it's difficult to present it for sort of, for the lack of a better word, sort of the user facing side of DeFi, because, you know, it's not built for them. It's like the average user doesn't interact with an EZ2 instance on Amazon, but you know, 90% of the web runs on EZ2 instances on Amazon. So like you as a user, you interact with the website, you don't need to know how to interact with those tools, but the person that runs that website, they know how to interact with those tools because that's how they keep it up and running, and that's what makes sure it keeps up and running. So, you know, in a similar method, how and that's why started talking a lot to like Johan and Sergey from Chainlink, and you know, there was a lot of overlap in terms of sort of what they're doing on a much grander scale and what Keeper is sort of doing on a micro scale. So it made a lot of overlap there, made sense, which is why like they are systematically taking it over in terms of like how it works and the infrastructure and all of that stuff, because like a big part to them is that same job. You know, it's how do you incentivize node operators to continuously do stuff on the Ethereum network. You know, like right now people sort of see that only as Chainlink is like price oracles, but what they actually are is collect data externally and then, you know, trigger something to happen on chain based on those data events that happened externally. And that can be anything, whether it's a price update, whether it's a harvest call, whether it's a liquidation, it doesn't matter. So like they already have this like, you know, super robust infrastructure for that. So like getting them to sort of like it's a little bit like using a nuke to clean a stain, you know, like it's almost overkill because their system's so much bigger than what Keeper requires. But at the same time, like it's just good to have that redundancy. So I'm really excited that like it's being heavily integrated there. But yeah, like at best, you know, you can think of it sort of as the back office of Ethereum. You know, it's the thing that on a smart contract level in a decentralized and autonomous way makes sure that all of these protocols keep running healthy and successfully in the way they're intended to do. So you as user don't interact with it, but like if it stops working, you're very quickly going to notice.
Absolutely. And wow, thank you for that explanation. It's really cool to see that you're now building B2B or protocol to protocol solutions and not just customer facing things, because I think it really matters for all of this becoming more efficient, right? And that I want to tie that into my next question, which is another project that I know is protocol to protocol, and that is the Iron Bank. And I think, if I'm not wrong, this ties into what we were speaking of in the last episode of just how capital efficiency needs to improve if we want DeFi to reach the world. So I'd love for you to give a brief explanation or long explanation, however you feel, of Iron Bank and how you got involved with that and what it's doing and where it's going.
Well, so the idea actually originally started from a discussion with Alpha Homora, where we were talking about, you know, because at that time they had their V1 and it was like ETH denominated, and we started talking about, you know, about how can we add stable coins and all of these other kinds of assets into this as well, because that's an area Yearn heavily focuses on. So and any area that can be created to facilitate additional yield or leveraged yield is something I want to strongly explore. And then as we continued that discussion, you know, we got to the point where we realized that Alpha in themselves are a lender, you know, but they're a lender to themselves. So I mean, if you think about it, the people that provide ETH, they're providing it for others to borrow, and they're providing it because they get an interest rate on it. But that others to borrow is just Alpha. So we started talking a lot about, you know, but how do we how do we sort of move that onus away from them? Because, you know, now they need to maintain the lender, they need to maintain liquidations, health positions, all of that kind of stuff. And like that's a lot of overhead if you just want to focus on how do you create leveraged yield positions for people, you know. So it's good. And you don't necessarily want to split that focus, because and maybe I'll touch on top of this when we talk about some of the like partnerships and acquisitions that the Yearn ecosystem does, because like every time I talk to a project, they're like, yeah, okay, but we'll just fork XYZ and then do that ourselves. And then I keep reminding them that, you know, it's incredibly short-sighted to think you can just fork one of these other projects and then sort of maintain it and keep it up, because it's not just the code. Like there's so much stuff happening around it in terms of maintenance, upkeep, enhancements, management, decision making. You know, it's not just I'm going to copy and paste it and be done. Because like it's very easy for a lot of these projects to sort of want to overlap into each other areas. And I'm a strong believer of focus on your niche, do your niche really well, and partners with others that do the thing that you don't do really well, and then combine those for maximum efficiency. Don't try and reinvent wheels. You know, when you make a new car, you don't start by designing a new wheel. You use the wheels that have already been designed and perfected, and you use those as part of your supply line. But sorry, I'm derailing a little bit. So the idea there was, you know, how do we move that onus away from alpha? And like that started the discussion about, okay, but how can we get sort of protocols, you know, Aave, or in this case Iron Bank or whatever, but you know, ideally I want to see it happening on a broader lender spectrum. Like this is sort of the first POC, and we'll see if it goes from there. So far it's successful. And you know, how do we, because what alpha does is exactly this. Like if you ignore quickly for 1 second that they're their own lender, and you now assume that this ETH was being supplied to Aave, right? And Aave said, okay, Alpha, you guys are allowed to borrow as much of this ETH as possible. And Aave is also exploring stuff there in terms of their credit delegation, which I actually want to build some prototypes on top of that as well to facilitate the exact same goal. Like it works a little bit differently because you sort of don't have that auto usage. You need people to delegate to you, but the net result from a user perspective looks the same. So anyway, back to the point. Alpha, if you remove the lender component, they're basically lending this ETH as a non-collateralized loan, and then they're using it in their strategies. And the reason they can use this is because, you know, their strategies are closed looped. So it's the same thing as a leverage position on an exchange. You know, if you go into a 10x leverage position, you can, and let's say I go 10x USDT into Wi-Fi and I buy Wi-Fi with 10x leverage. You can keep that on the exchange, but I can't take that Wi-Fi out of the ecosystem because they have to keep it closed loop to make sure they can handle the liquidations and make sure that those funds are available if they need it to cover your position. And that's what all these smart contracts are. They're essentially these little closed loop ecosystems. Now for up until now, it's been very siloed. You know, each one sort of focuses on their own little closed loop ecosystem. And they just stick to that. So I've been big in trying to push all of the sort of protocols to you know, stop thinking in terms of just you and like start thinking in terms of how can you leverage everyone else in the ecosystem. Obviously, it requires a lot of trust. It requires a lot of sort of communication and working closely together. But we need to get there because it's not going to be a one rules them all kind of situation. And yeah, and the Iron Bank sort of just expanded from there because then we realized, okay, but look, we can do the same with Yearn. You know, and it started because from sort of the lender perspective, right? If people provide collateral, they just want to maximize borrowing as much as possible because the more that gets borrowed, the better interest rate, the more collateral that gets deposited, et cetera, et cetera. So and there's so much, you know, unused collateral just sitting there that's not capital being put to work, and that capital can be put to work if you allow protocols to put it to work, you know, either via credit delegation or via something like Iron Bank. So this protocol to protocol interaction just means you don't need that over collateralized position because you know it's a closed loop system. The inter-protocol communication allows things like if you need a large user that wants to exit their position, you know, the protocol A can ask protocol B, hey, please return X amount of the funds, and they do so that that person can exit. So, you know, it also adds additional security on the interacting party. And I do think it's a strong push, as we discussed last time, towards strong capital efficiency, in terms of how do we put each dollar worth of value in DeFi to work, because that's where we want to end up. Like we don't want any capital just sitting there not doing anything. Everything that is in this ecosystem has to be working 100% of the time, and that's what Iron Bank allows. Now I've seen some interesting critiques about that as well, and I agree with the critiques 100%, because it's like, okay, well, if I deposit DAI into Iron Bank, right, and that DAI is automatically used by Alpha or Yearn for a leveraged position, and then they're earning 30% APY, but I'm only earning, let's say for argument's sake, 20% APY, because again, Alpha and Yearn or whatever systems are only going to use it as long as they can get more value out of it than it costing them to borrow it. I mean, that's a pretty basic statement. And then the argument is, okay, but why do I even put the DAI into the system then? Because I can just put it into Yearn and earn more. And that's a 100% valid statement if your only goal is to maximize what you're going to do with the DAI. The thing that people forget to add onto there is that this is still a normal lender. So this isn't about, I have DAI, how do I maximize what I can do with my DAI? This is about, I have idle assets that I am long on this asset for whatever reason, and I want to provide this asset as collateral, and I want to borrow something else against it. So from that perspective, there's a lot of extra utility that gets added there. There's a lot of extra usage you can get out of it, more so than just I am maximizing what I'm doing with this, but instead I can supply it there. I can still earn, let's say 20% because it's being put to use, but I can still use it as collateral and still borrow something else and use that.
So you have this closed loop system that can be one protocol or several protocols that are interacting in a way as a centralized exchange would with leverage. But would it be like, what happens if another protocol without the permission, would it need the permission of the other two to enter this closed loop system, or could someone just enter and disrupt the process that's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, this is like a bank providing a under collateralized loan to a partner. They're not going to do that unless that partner is vetted, is trusted. They can check the books, they can audit it, they can make sure everything is above board and how it should be. And this works exactly the same way. So a person can't be whitelisted for zero collateral usage unless those contracts are pre-deployed, it's been audited, it's been vetted, the other partners have reviewed, have vetted. I don't want to say, it's trust-based, because you don't have to trust, but it's review and audit-based. So unless you pass those checks and balances, you're simply not going to be allowed in the ecosystem.
Understood. So, okay, cool. So you can't just have a rogue agent coming in and disrupting everything, which makes sense. I mean, if not, that would be too dangerous. But does that in some ways, because I know you're a strong proponent of decentralization and allowing anyone to tap into these open source projects, does that take away from that, or is it just a necessity of growing out the ecosystem?
It 100% takes away from it, but at this point, there's no real way to circumvent it. Until code is capable of analyzing itself in some kind of static fashion and then deciding that it is safe to use within the EVM, it needs to be external decision based on review and these kinds of things. Like as code's getting smarter, we might get to a point where it is possible to decentralize this, but in the near-term future, no, it's definitely going to be authoritarian in terms of which protocols are up to the standards. Because there's small things you have to look at as well. Is a contract upgradable? Because if it's upgradable, that adds a different risk vector. And now you don't necessarily want to deploy it there if they can just, change the implementation at any given point. So there's a bunch of little micro decisions that need to happen along with it. So like while it would be awesome to make this, fully decentralized, and I think we'll get there eventually, that's definitely not going to happen in the near-term future.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I've had this discussion with some proponents in the ecosystem as well. And I mean, even Vitalik said it, sometimes you need a tyranny or dictatorship in programming to make things work and continue forward. Another question, Andre, on something you're working on that I'm curious about, because I know on the last episode we spoke quite a bit on impermanent loss, and I know you're building IL hedge with SushiSwap and perhaps others. What is this? How do you prevent impermanent loss in these systems?
I mean, the straight up answer is currently it doesn't. Like it mitigates it, but the big problem is in terms of how sort of these pools work when they interact with each other. So I'm going to try and walk through this example. It's a little bit easier to illustrate, but I'll try my best. So let's start with a Uniswap pool, right? A fresh new Uniswap pool. And you're the first LP, and you deposit in 1 Ethereum, and just for the sake of making the math easy, 1,000 USDC or DAI. Let's go with 1 ETH, 1 DAI. So now this pool has 1 ETH and it has 1,000 DAI in it. So if you look at that, that means 1 ETH is worth 1,000 DAI. Now a trader comes along, and the trader decides, okay, but he wants to buy ETH, and he wants half of the ETH, right? So he wants 0.5 of the ETH out. Now the way the Uniswap formula works, X times Y has to be greater or equal to K, is that if you want half of the side out, you have to provide half of the other side in. So for me to take out that 0.5, I need to actually put in another 1,000 DAI because I'm taking half out, so I need to put, double in. So now I just paid a 1,000 DAI for 0.5 ETH. So this means the price of 1 ETH is now 2,000 DAI from the trader's perspective. If we look at the LP, however, if he were to withdraw his funds right now, he has 0.5 ETH and he has 2,000 DAI. So for him, 1 ETH is actually worth 4,000 DAI. So in terms of ETH, he just lost more than 50% of his value, but in terms of DAI, he just doubled his value. So that's sort of what starts happening when you look at the LP perspective and like the losses they're taking on, because theirs is sort of disproportional to the trader. And now, like as with normal, like Uniswap, SushiSwap, whatever it is, the more liquidity, the less of an impact this is. Like I'm illustrating this in a very extreme scenario. But so now what the IL solutions we've used so far do is, okay, so for purpose of this conversation, I need to explain how the IL system currently works. So just sort of try and remember this image of how this trader perspective works, but I'm just going to park there and quickly explain the IL side. So how the IL side works is let's say you wanna LP into Uniswap, right? And you have ETH, and you want to LP into ETH DAI. But now you don't want DAI exposure for whatever reason. You just want ETH exposure. So what you would do is you would take, let's say, another ETH. You would then borrow that DAI, either mint it or you get it from Aave or whatever you want. And then you would put that borrowed DAI and your 1 ETH into the pool. So now you have ETH exposure, but you don't actually have DAI exposure because you're actually in a net short position on the DAI because you borrowed it and you didn't convert to it, and you still have your ETH on the other side. So now when I remove my funds, I still have my ETH exposure and I don't have my DAI side risk. I mean, this is basically how you sort of mitigate LP, I say in quotes, because it's IL because it's not really true, but it sort of gets the same net result. So IL hedge at this point does exactly that. Like when you provide, but it combines these two elements. So when you provide that 1 ETH, it goes, okay, well, I'm going to mint you 1,000 DAI, and I'm automatically going to put you as in a debt position. So you now owe me 1,000 DAI because I'm using your 1 ETH that you're giving me as collateral for this 1,000 DAI. And then at the same time, I'm going to put this 1 ETH you gave me and this 1,000 DAI into the pool. So in this way, I'm using that ETH as collateral, and because I'm minting it and creating it as debt for you, I'm automatically creating that short component for you. So from an LP perspective, you're now doing single-sided exposure, and you're protected against IL because you've got this net short position. And like if the pool of liquidity is large enough so that the pool shifts in the same fashion as the trader is priced, then you're good. Then you don't actually have any exaggerated gains or losses based on how the pool moves. The problem is now, if we take this back to this previous example, in this previous example, you have 0.5 ETH and 2,000 DAI. So now if you sell that 4,000 DAI, but if you sell that 4,000 DAI, like you're only going to get 0.5 ETH. So you end up with still only 1 ETH and still 1,000 debt. So because the way the pools move in an exaggerated fashion, it actually means that your debt position can very quickly become under collateralized based on trades too large for the pool. So now that part isn't solved yet, but like all of the previous steps, are solved. Like in terms of it mints it uses it as collateral, it backs it, it creates a debt position for you. So the ILV2 that we're currently using is going a lot better than the ILV1, because the problem with ILV1 is when we launched it, people. So in this example, you've got ETH DAI. People started buying DAI because they assumed it was a speculative asset instead of a transfer asset. So the more they kept on buying the DAI out of the ecosystem, the more these exponential sort of losses started happening on the LP sides, because more and more of the value, which is supposed to be equivalent, is leaving the ecosystem, which is why I had to do the V2, which actually only allows it to trade in between pools to try and keep the value, in an equilibrium. But like little things like that happens with each iteration. So not there yet, but each iteration is getting us a step closer to where we want to be. But the net result is you need to get those three things right. You need to use the asset the person is providing as collateral to mint the new transfer token. You need to create a debt position for that transfer token so that person, it doesn't have price exposure to it and they only have to repay the base. And then number 3 is you need to get the LPs ratios to be in line with what's happening on the trader values. Now that number 3 is the current one that we're trying to tackle, but like without just exponentially minting more or exponentially burning more, like I'm struggling to find a nice solution there. But like that's how these things go. Like you get to the problem statement and you start working it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were saying, I assume pools with more liquidity make this way easier, and pools with less liquidity make it way harder. Is that correct?
Correct. And so if there's enough liquidity, the problem disappears. But like that's not a proper solution. I want it to work even on low liquidity pools. Because like even though it might not affect the small trader in a big pool, it just needs a big enough trader to come along to then create that same cascading effect. So that's the next part we have to solve. But like it's already iterated so far from where it originally started, kind of like YSwap to where it is now. That I'm very, very happy with the progress, and I'm really excited to see what it has become. But it's not ready yet.
Perfect. Thanks for the explanation. And I should have asked this earlier, Andre, but I want to go back real quick to credit delegation and what we were speaking about with the Iron Bank. And I know you touched upon credit delegation with Aave, and I'd love to hear what's the difference there. And I'm assuming it's more complicated when it's not an automatic lending system like Alpha Homora, and it's this user delegation like is happening on Aave. How does the system have to work to embrace that difference there, where someone can come in and change parameters anytime?
Can you rephrase that for me a little bit?
So when you're speaking of Iron Bank, you're speaking of how Alpha Homora is an automatic lending system, while on Aave, it's the credit delegation of the user that's being interacted with. What's the difference as far as allowing this solution to work on Alpha Homora than it would work on Aave, for example?
So Aave is closer to Iron Bank than it is to Alpha Homora. To use it as an example, let's say I'm a large collateral provider to Aave and I have $1 million worth of credit. I can then say I delegate my $1 million worth of credit in ETH to Alpha Homora. Now Alpha Homora can withdraw from my credit line whenever they need more ETH. If they don't need it, they don't draw it. If they do need it, they do draw it. But now with something like credit delegation, you add a few additional rules on top. So like I'll say you can borrow my credit, but you owe me an extra 1% to repay or whatever, because it's sort of peer to business or peer to peer in that case. Mm-hmm. Versus with Iron Bank, it just doesn't care about any of those rules. It's just like I have collateral, use as much as you need, as long as you repay it back, I'm not going to care. But like you can create an intermediary contract that people can, and that is what I'm currently busy with, that people can delegate their credit to, and then it sort of handles all of that logic. So it's sort of the pooled contract where everyone can delegate to. That contract then allows something like Alpha, Mora, or Ironbank or whatever to just borrow as much credit as it needs and to go from there. But that's still sort of a prototype at this point. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, that was my question. I phrased it poorly, but in this case, is Keeper also running the contract calls in the back end for this stuff?
Well, there's nothing that needs to happen here in terms of, well, something like liquidations, yes, but because this is user interacted, so Alpha Mora doesn't borrow from Ironbank unless it needs to borrow, and it only needs to borrow if a user creates a new position and wants to borrow. So that means the transaction is initiated by the user, which triggers the Alpha Mora contracts, which triggers the Ironbank contracts. So because there is an initiating entity, you don't need something like Keeper in this situation.
Understood. Okay, and it cascades all the way through. Perfect. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little slow here trying to pick up some of these concepts, but incorporating them little by little.
No worries, my man, it's good.
Another question for you, Andre, is recently just scrolling on Twitter, I saw that Synthetics and you and Curve all published the same Ethereum contract. What was going on there? What happened recently between all you three?
Are you talking about the VSynth stuff that Curve did, where they allow those large liquidity cross asset swaps?
Yeah, the ones with no slippage.
Oh yeah. I literally had nothing to do with that. I just happened to see the contracts and I thought it was a cool transaction, so I shared it. That's 100% the Curve team. They did all the work, they did all the implementation, they did all the detail. I was just a coincidental bystander at the time. So what's happening there is so Curve, allows you to swap between stable coins and BTC and ETH. So you can go USDC to SUSD, which is Synthetics USD, or you can go BTC to SBTC, which is Synthetics BTC, or you can go ETH to SETH, which is Synthetic ETH. So now you can very easily go USDC to SUSD. And now this is where synthetics becomes important, because now synthetics, I know people tend to think, it's sort of SUSD, and it's in the name. It's a synthetic platform. They create SEuro, they create SBTC, they create SUSD, but their main thing is actually they're a zero slippage trading system. So within synthetics, if you go onto their exchange, synthetics.exchange, you can, and if I have 1 million SUSD, I can do a zero slippage swap between 1 million SUSD to 1 million worth of SBTC. That's their entire system. It allows these fees and those kinds of things dependent, but there's no order book slippage to be a little bit more technically exact.
Got it.
And anyone can do that. So you could have gone to Curve, taken $1 million worth of USDC, traded it to SUSD, then go on to synthetics.exchange, then trade your SUSD to SBTC, wait for that trade to finalize, because within synthetics, trades aren't atomic, to avoid stuff like front running the Oracle updates and fee reclamation and stuff like that. So it takes up to 6 minutes for the transaction to finalize. And then when it finalized and you had $1 million worth of SBTC, I could go back to Curve and I could trade that SBTC to wrapped BTC. And then you did exactly the same sequence of events. Curve just went along and automated all of that. So now you can just go USDC to WBTC without any slippage, and that's just what's happening in the back end.
God, composability is sexy.
That's what it comes down to. It's more and more projects working more and more together.
The next line of questioning, Andrew, is on what you were saying earlier about your ecosystem acquisitions or incorporations, or however they're called in this space, which I'm not too sure. What's going on that front? I know you guys have been acquiring and bringing in a lot of companies into the Yearn ecosystem, such as Cream. What is continuing there, and what was the impetus behind doing these mechanisms?
So it comes back to, do the thing you do well and focus on that thing. But so now, for example, if you look at Yearn in isolation, it's going to look for the best yield opportunities, and it's going to deposit assets there. How do you make that a lot more powerful? Well, one way to make it a lot more powerful is allow the output assets to be used as collateral in something like a lender. Because now if I can take my tokenized output and use that as collateral and borrow against it, all of a sudden I can create a leveraged position for my user without them needing to do anything, which means increased yields based on that net deficit between how much does it cost to borrow versus how much yield am I making on top of it, of course. So having something like an integrated lender that's very friendly to the protocol makes a lot of sense. There's that's sort of an easy example. At the same time, having insurance on a sort of per vault level gives users a lot more comfort. So having a partner that sort of prioritizes those changes helps a lot more. Having a team that's very B2B focused and very UI focused helps a lot in terms of like presentation, all of that stuff. So, a partner like Acro helps a lot in that environment. Having additional strategists that do the same sort of work and that can build the same sort of strategies, which means more strategies faster across more assets, creates a lot of cross value. So, that's where someone like Pickle fits in very easily. It's always hey, how do we make thing A little bit better? And then it normally comes to, okay, but we need to build thing B. But like my answer is always, don't build it yourself. Find experts who focus in that field and get them to sort of help you prioritize those features. So that's I whatever the nomenclature is, and I don't really know, but like it's dev, mergers, acquisitions, whatever you want. Like it's more on a talent level where like it's about having all of these teams aware of each other. It's about having them all aligned towards the same sort of goals, towards what's the benefit this ad, what's the value this ad, how does it add to my partners. It's making them all a lot more smart contract to smart contract focused, because what was happening a lot is a lot of these protocols were starting to become very end user focused. And very end user focused isn't necessarily very smart contract focused. And in DeFi, you always need to be smart contract focused, because you want to build for other people building on top of you. If that's a prohibitive to work with, less people are going to integrate with you. And we've seen that, the protocols that really flourish are the ones that are very easy to work with on a developer level. So the three core components there is, how do we leverage off of each other in a stronger way? How do we get everyone aligned towards the same focus? How do we make sure everyone is building on a code level so that we can all interact with each other? On sort of the last level, Jörn took a lot of time to build a very robust review and security infrastructure in terms of like the audits they have available, the audits companies they work with and have on retainer, and like the developer talent they have to review code. So it's also natural to sort of offer that to as many projects as possible to make sure that they go through that pipeline and it's as secure and as vetted and et cetera as is possible. And then just trying to have everyone focus on their niche field, but at the same time focus in the areas that creates the most value for the rest of the people in the ecosystem. So as long as problem statements keep popping up and there is a company that's doing that solution, we'll want to drag that into the sort of umbrella to make sure everyone's aligned.
And is there an ownership in some sense, or is it more along the lines of a partnership? How does it does Jörn buy the tokens of these other projects, or how does that function?
It doesn't really work on a token level. So like I always separate sort of what happens on tokens and that kind of stuff, because like the other thing is, these are if you look at all of the with the exception of Acro, if you look at all of the projects that are in this, they're all 100% decentralized. Like there's no incorporated entity, there's no ownership, there's no shareholdership, there's no board of directors. None of the stuff exists. Mm-hmm. Like it's all protocols that existed with other arrays that were just released into the public, and they have these communities around them. So it's more about all of the developers working together, being in the same room, talking about the same things, and aligning in terms of that, and less about trying to dictate what the communities should do, or how they should govern themselves, or what they should be focused on. I don't want to touch the token stuff, because as soon as you start touching the token stuff and you do swaps or you trades or any of these things, you start treading in sort of financial waters. Mm-hmm. And that's more headache than the value it creates. So each community still runs in terms of its own DAO, its own governance system, and all of that. This is a lot more about all of the developers working together and all of them being aligned towards similar goals, similar objectives, and similar value propositions.
And how the heck do you guys coordinate all of this? Is it just along the lines of each person has their expertise and what they're passionate about and they work on that? or is someone sort of delegating where things need to go?
I mean, each let's call it unit, sort of self-organized in terms of who are devs, who are leaders, who are managing. So Cream sort of as Leo that's handling it on sort of a project management side, and then everyone sort of the devs from there. Sushi has Maki, Akra has Anna, Pickle has Larry, etc. So they're all self-organized. It's more about just the longer term alignment, because everyone knows what they want to build, but it's very easy to look at that in a very siloed fashion and not in terms of, okay, but what changes should I make that will add more benefit to it's basically like talking to your customer, right? That's what it comes down to. Like when if you look at something like Cover, they can be just providing cover to end users. But how you provide cover to end users is very different than how do you provide cover to something like a Yearn Vault, because a Yearn Vault will want to automatically sort of buy cover and interact with that, and that has to happen on a smart contract level and not on a sort of website level. So just that sort of difference in mindset makes a big difference in terms of what you develop, how you develop, and that extra. So like each unit is still responsible for its own niche, its own innovation, its own value capture towards its token holders, etc. But it's understanding that we are each other's customers and keeping that conversation constantly fluid in terms of what do you as my provider need to provide to me, and what do I as your customer want from you.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense, because I was curious, like I know how complex it can be to manage one team notwithstanding 6 different teams or whatever. It seems like it could be a monumental headache as well as a challenge. Andre?
Yeah, look, the beauty is all of these teams are autonomous. So they don't need oversight, they don't need management. There's just benefits in adding that along extra.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume everyone now, when they're building, think in the terms of how this could potentially grow the ecosystem in general, rather than just what
Correct.
they're building.
And like that's really the core value proposition is everyone's building thinking about everyone else.
Yeah, that's great. Fuck, I love DeFi so much. So much. Another thing I know that's going on in the Yearn ecosystem is that you guys are creating a mechanism to have a dev fund. How is that going? Has there been progress? Are the discussions flowing?
Oh, no clue. I'm not involved. I'm as distant from that as humanly possible. Like I'm not a core Yearn dev. So the value proposition there doesn't. I shouldn't have a say in it. So I'm leaving it to the people that should have a say in it. So I can't comment on that, unfortunately. I have zero clue.
Understood. And from the perspective of you saying this, that you're not a Yearn dev, is that because, as you were saying, you're basically just building in general for the ecosystem and that fits into where it may?
Yeah, that if I build something and it naturally fits with SushiSwap, I'm gonna give it to them. If I build something that naturally fits with Yearn, I'm gonna give it to them. It's the same reason why I originally launched Wi-Fi. The goal was to be able to walk away from the platform, to have a token that incentivizes and creates a DAO around it. That means that those people are incentivized in the correct methods to build out the protocol, continue maintaining the protocol, and do all of those things. And the goal there was so that I can walk away from it, and like that hasn't changed. So it's the same reason I don't take tokens from any of these projects or do any kind of incentivized work, because I feel that's a misalignment of my incentives. I always want to build what I think creates value. I don't want to build something that I think creates value for a token.
Got it. Does that feel strange for you, though, seeing all the financial value accrual going on to all these things that have your direct hand in them and you not taking part of it, or are you at peace with that?
No, look, there's always a conflict there, but like it's like that blog post I wrote a few weeks back, like I know a lot of people took it a lot more serious than it is. Like those are like things in the back of your head that like pop up and you think about every so often, but like they're not at the forefront, like it's not a driving force that like makes you spiteful or anything. So like, I mean, there are definitely times when like I sit back and I think about how many millionaires I created versus the value capture. Like I mean, from if I look at how much gas I've spent on my deployer account, that's already more than I've been able to accrue in value from having built Yearn or Keeper. So then there are times that I'm annoyed by it, and that's why I wrote it to get it out of my system and sort of flush it so that I can just move on. Because I don't want that to influence my decision making. But yeah, I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it. But it's not a strong motivator or strong deterrent. Like it pops up and then I'm like, fuck off, I don't want to think about you now, and then I continue doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, and that seems to be a recurring theme where people just take you way too seriously. Maybe it's the curse of being very intelligent, Andre. Just
I don't know, man. Like so often I tweet something that has zero context. Like I'm just tweeting something because I think it's cool, and then people will be like, yeah, no, but he's sure I actually had this conversation earlier with someone where it was about you know when you were like in school or university or whatever, and you did a language course, and like there was a poem, and your teacher would always be like, yeah, but at this point the poet means that this actually means their sorrow and depression or whatever. Meanwhile, the poet just wrote, the bird is blue, or something as simplistic as that. And like I feel that happens so often, where like stop trying to read meaning into what's happening. I'm not that deep. Like what I wrote there is what it is, the end. And I'm actually annoyed by like how out of context that blog post was taken. Like I even started it off by saying that this is the bad, not the good. This is just sort of cathartic. This is just like a therapeutic process. Because what's important to me, and I think this is one of the areas where I sort of get the most shit, is because like I like talking about the bad. Like I don't think you should bottle it up inside and not speak about it, because that's when bad shit happens. Like it's important to let it out there. And another reason I like putting it out there is because there are lots of other devs that are struggling as well, and like it's important for them to know that, look, it is shit, but like it's shit for all of us. You're not alone. So like don't feel isolated. Reach out for help. Like don't let this stuff sort of destroy your perception. Like leverage the community, leverage the other builders in the space, all of this kinds of stuff. But yeah, I often think there are just too many people in the space that made too much money too quickly, and now they're sort of retired and they don't have anything to do, so they just want to sit on Twitter and Telegram and try and drum up any drama they can to sort of make themselves more excitable or create some feeling in their lives. Because I definitely think people take the stuff way too seriously.
I agree with that. And I think it does tie into that as well, as you were saying, with just this rapid wealth accrual and sort of how that can kill meaning or the purpose people have been feeling. So some alternative has to come up. And going back to what you were saying, it's like, it's so true. Jung would totally agree with you that you can't just bottle up all these things, and it's good to share it and express it and put it out there and write it down. It is therapeutic. So I haven't read that blog post, but I'll take a look at it.
It was just a random rant. Like I do it once a year. I'll do another one next year. Whatever is annoying me then. Like when I start the new year, I like sort of getting that negativity out, so that it's out there. I can deal with it, and like then I can focus on the goals I set for myself at the start of the year.
How are you feeling about cross-chain projects? About building things on other chains, just Solana and Polkadot and stuff of that nature?
Look, I mean, as sort of a top layer builder, to me, it's about where are the protocols and where is the assets. When the assets and the protocols and the infrastructure is there, it makes sense to build there. But like I wasn't the team that launched USDT on Ethereum. And like that's the team that has to be the first mover. It has to be the USDT that launches on Ethereum, then on Solana, then on Polkadot, then on AvaX, whatever it is they're launching on. And then and then the next team has to be there. And I'm not the low level protocol builder. I'm not the AMM builder. I'm not the lending builder. So those need to then appear in that ecosystem, and they have to have a reason, and they need to be incentivized to build their protocol on there. And like at that point, you start getting to the point where I start building. But like me trying to build on other chains now is a little bit pointless, because like the assets aren't there, the protocols aren't there, and the users aren't there. So like if none of them are there, why am I building there? It's like you want to build a new convenience store, but you could build it out in the middle of the desert where there's no homes. Like until the roads are there and the homes are there, there's no point for me to set up my shop. So like that's happening, and like we can see more assets launching on other chains, and we can see specific chains becoming more sort of bespoke to their specific niche. Like you'll maybe trade off security for a little bit more usability. So there's something like the maps.me thing that launched on Solana now. Like it makes sense there. It needs higher speed and throughput, but it doesn't necessarily need as high security. Something like that. So you'll see these things popping up and happening, but like as someone that builds financial tools, I'll experiment and dabble on other chains, but until the assets, the protocols, and the users are there, there's very little reason for me to set up shop.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's good to hear that you're not just completely fuck all these other chains, I'm only going to stay on Ethereum. I'm happy to. I know you've said this before, but I'm happy to hear that you feel the same way.
Yeah, look. To me, it's about that shop example. Like I will set up the shop wherever there are users that need the goods I'm selling. If the need exists, I'm going to present the solution.
Yep, give the man his building blocks and user base. So that's a good goal for all these other chains. If any listeners are here, and I'll definitely take the word back to our chain as well. But yeah, Andre, that was the questions, or were the questions I had for you. As always, I really appreciate speaking with you and your time. I know you're busy. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, man. And I look forward to the fourth one.
Sounds good to me.